Old veteran was just sweeping the range until U.S. Marine snipers dared him to compete. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was just another day at the training range, where young Marines were being put through their paces. The air was thick with tension as they honed their skills. The hum of gunfire filled the air, punctuated by the occasional shout of a commanding officer barking orders. The atmosphere was one of confidence, a place where Marines were the best of the best, each one eager to prove their worth. But in the corner of the range, quietly going about his business, was an old man. At first glance, he seemed out of place. Dressed in simple clothes, he was seen pushing a broom back and forth across the dusty floor of the range. His presence barely registered with the young Marines. The ones closest to him exchanged glances, rolling their eyes at the sight of the elderly figure. He wasn't in uniform, wasn't holding a rifle, and certainly wasn't a part of the current training. He was just a janitor, seemingly there to do a menial job. But there was something about his demeanor that caught the eye of one Marine in particular. Sergeant Evan Matthews, a young sniper in training, looked over at the old man and smirked. The sight of him was almost laughable. "What's he doing here?" he muttered to his partner, Specialist Jackson. "This isn't the place for old-timers like him. He's probably just here to sweep up after us." The two Marines chuckled, but Matthews wasn't content with just laughing in his mind. He had to say something out loud. With a grin, he walked up to the old man. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out. "You sure you're in the right place? This is a sniper range, not a retirement home." The old man didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He simply continued sweeping, his movements slow but deliberate. Matthews wasn't going to let it go that easily. "You think you could even hit a target from 100 yards? Maybe you'd better stick to sweeping, old man." The words hung in the air. The other Marines nearby snickered, some even pointing at the old man as if he were some kind of joke. But the old man said nothing. He continued sweeping, his expression calm, his eyes focused on the ground beneath him. It was clear that he wasn't fazed by the mockery. Matthews was about to walk away when he glanced at the target range down the field. A challenge started to form in his mind. "You know what?" he said with a devilish grin. "How about this? If you think you're such a sharpshooter, I dare you to take a shot. I bet you can't even hit that target at 500 yards. The old man didn't look up. But then, without a word, he set the broom aside. The Marines watched, intrigued and skeptical. He walked toward a nearby rifle, an old bolt-action M40, and picked it up with ease. Matthews raised an eyebrow, feeling both amusement and slight confusion. "All right, Grandpa," he said. "Let's see what you've got." He stepped aside to give the old man space, but there was no smile on his face anymore, just a quiet anticipation. The other Marines watched in silence. The old man didn't rush. He carefully adjusted the scope, his movements methodical. Then, without further hesitation, he aimed at the target in the distance. The wind was strong that day, swirling unpredictably across the range. The Marines had struggled with it all day, their targets appearing to shift with every shot. But the old man, despite his age, showed no sign of hesitation. With a deep breath, he squeezed the trigger. The sound of the rifle firing echoed across the range, but it was the result that left everyone frozen in place. The target, at 500 yards, was hit dead center. Not just a hit, a perfect bullseye. The Marines stood in stunned silence. Matthews, who had been so sure that this old man was nothing more than a joke, couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the wind was louder than anything else. Then, one of the other snipers, Corporal Hayes, stepped forward. "Who is this guy?" he whispered, his voice laced with respect. The old man slowly lowered the rifle and turned, his eyes meeting Matthews. "I wasn't always just sweeping," he said quietly, "but I've seen more of this range than you'll ever know." Matthews, still in shock, didn't know how to respond. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. He had underestimated this old man, and now he realized just how wrong he had been. The challenge, once a joke, had turned into a moment of respect, a lesson in humility. And as the old man walked away, The Marines were left with a quiet realization. They had witnessed a legend at work. The Marines stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the old man as he slowly lowered the rifle. It had only taken one shot, one perfectly placed bullet, to shift the balance of power in that moment. The wind still howled, pushing the tall grass in waves, but for those few seconds, it felt like everything had stopped. Matthews, the young sniper who had mocked him just moments ago, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He had expected the old man to fail. Hell, he had been sure of it. But now, standing before him, was the unmistakable proof that this man was not just some old janitor. The old man's eyes met Matthews for a brief moment before he slowly began to speak, his voice low, carrying the weight of experience. "It's not about the weapon," he said, his tone steady and calm. "It's about knowing how to read the wind, understanding the terrain, feeling the shot before you take it. You think the gear makes the shooter, but it's the shooter that makes the gear." Matthews wanted to respond, to argue, but there were no words. The old man, whose name Matthews still didn't know, had just turned everything Matthews had learned about sniper shooting on its head. He had thought his modern equipment, his state-of-the-art rifles, would be enough to guarantee a win. But here was this man, with an old, worn rifle and the kind of experience that could only be earned in the most brutal of conditions, showing him up with ease. "What's your name?" Matthews finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man smiled faintly, but didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and began to walk away from the firing line, his pace slow and deliberate, as if he didn't have a care in the world. "You don't need to know my name," he said over his shoulder. "But you should remember one thing. It's not the weapon you carry that makes you a sniper. It's the years you've spent learning how to read the world around you." Matthews watched him walk off, every step carrying an air of quiet confidence. The other Marines, who had been watching in silence, slowly began to gather their wits. The shock was starting to wear off, but the respect was growing. Matthews had always prided himself on his skill, his ability to shoot long distances with precision. But now, he realized that there was so much more to the art of sniping than just hitting a target. The old man had shown him that. As he stood there, trying to process everything that had just happened, one of the other snipers, Corporal Hayes, spoke up. "You know who that is, right?" Matthews shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. "That's Chief Warrant Officer Dean Peters," Hayes continued, his voice filled with awe. "He's a living legend. He's been involved in some of the most classified operations in the military. They say he's responsible for more confirmed kills than anyone else in the Corps. He's one of the first snipers to ever develop the technique of shooting in crosswinds, and he did it with nothing more than an old rifle and a few scraps of gear." Matthews' eyes widened in disbelief. The old man, Dean Peters, had been part of the military's most secretive operations, and here he was, sweeping the range like it was just another day. Matthews felt a sudden wave of humility wash over him. He had just challenged a legend, a man whose skill and experience had shaped the very foundation of modern sniping. "So he really is a sniper?" Matthews asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not just some old man sweeping the floor?" "Not just any sniper," Hayes replied. "He's the sniper. The one who taught all of us how to truly read the field. They say his shots could hit targets at over 1,000 yards in the worst conditions. He's one of the few to ever be awarded the Silver Star for his actions in combat." Matthews stood there, his mind racing as he processed the gravity of what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about understanding the true meaning of skill and experience. The old man, the janitor, had just given him a lesson he would never forget. As the day went on, the Marines went back to their training, but the memory of Dean Peters' perfect shot stayed with them. Matthews couldn't help but look at the old man with a newfound respect. Dean Peters had shown him that true mastery didn't come from the newest equipment or the latest technology. It came from years of experience, of reading the world around you, of knowing how to make the shot before you even pull the trigger. Matthews had learned more in that one moment than he had in all his years of training. And as the sun began to set, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, there was more to being a Marine than he had ever realized. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air on the range grew still, the tension from earlier still hanging in the air like smoke. Matthews and the other Marines were quiet, their thoughts drifting back to the old man. The legend they hadn't realized was standing right in front of them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that went beyond what they had trained for. The old man, Dean Peters, had shown them a side of sniping they had never truly understood. But Matthews couldn't stop himself from wondering. How had he kept such a low profile all these years? Was he content to live out his days in quiet anonymity, sweeping the floors of a range while silently bearing the weight of his incredible history? It didn't sit right with Matthews. He had to know more. As the Marines packed up their gear for the day, Matthews found himself walking toward the edge of the range, where the old man was gathering his things. His rifle, his tools, everything was handled with the same careful precision that Matthews had witnessed earlier. He moved slowly, but there was an air of purpose in his movements, an undeniable presence that commanded respect. Matthews hesitated for a moment before walking up to him. "Hey, Dean," he said, his voice more respectful than before. The old man turned, his pale blue eyes meeting Matthews with a calm, unflinching gaze. Matthews swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say thank you for showing me something I didn't know I needed to learn." Dean Peters nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You didn't need to thank me," he said quietly. "You just needed to listen, to learn. Sometimes that's all it takes." Matthews felt a lump form in his throat. The old man wasn't just talking about sniping. He was talking about life, about the humility that came with experience, and the wisdom that could only be earned through years of hard, brutal service. "How did you do it?" Matthews asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you make that shot?" "I've trained for years, and I've never seen anything like it." Dean's eyes softened, just for a moment. "It's not about the shot, son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless years in the field. "It's about understanding your environment, knowing the wind, the terrain, and most importantly, yourself. If you don't know who you are and what you can do, the shot will never matter." Matthews nodded slowly, taking in every word. The old man's wisdom hit him hard. He had always thought that success came from having the best gear, the best training, the best rifle. But now, standing here, he realized that it was much deeper than that. "I didn't even know who you were when I first saw you," Matthews admitted. "I just thought you were some old man cleaning the range. But you've been a part of things I can't even imagine, haven't you?" Dean looked off into the distance for a long moment. The wind picked up again, swirling around them as the sky grew darker. "I've seen more than most," he said, his voice distant. "I've been to places you can't find on any map, and I've done things that most would never even believe. But that was a long time ago. I don't do it for the glory, Matthews. I do it because it's in my blood, because I've lived through it, and because there's still work to be done." Matthews couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he stood there, listening to this man, who had lived through some of the most harrowing experiences imaginable, speaking with such quiet strength. Dean Peters wasn't just a sniper. He was a force of nature, a living testament to the value of experience and the unspoken bonds formed in the heat of battle. Matthews wanted to ask more, to learn everything he could from the old man, but he could tell that Dean wasn't the type to open up easily. "I'm not going to ask you about your past," Matthews said, his voice firm with newfound respect. "But if you ever decide to teach, you've got an eager student right here." Dean chuckled softly, the first time Matthews had heard him laugh. "Maybe I'll teach you one day. But for now, Matthews, just remember, the real lesson isn't in the shot. It's in what happens after the shot. That's when you'll know if you've really learned." Matthews stood silently for a moment, absorbing the old man's words. As Dean turned to leave, Matthews watched him go, feeling as though he had just witnessed the closing of a chapter in military history. The man had lived through it all, and yet, here he was, walking away quietly, leaving behind a legacy that would never be fully understood by those who hadn't been there. Matthews couldn't help but think about the future. He had a long way to go, but now, with the old man's lesson in his heart, he knew he would approach every challenge with the humility and awareness that Dean Peters had shown him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthews knew one thing for sure. The world of sniping, of military life, was more than just skill and equipment. It was about understanding, respect, and, above all, the quiet strength that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. The next morning, the range was buzzing with activity. The sun hung high, casting a golden hue over the training grounds. The usual sounds of rifles firing and commands being shouted filled the air. But today, there was an undercurrent of tension among the Marines. Word had spread quickly about what had happened yesterday. The legend of Dean Peters was no longer a quiet, forgotten memory. Now, it was something real, something the young Marines could touch. Matthews had woken up that morning with one thing on his mind. He needed to know more. He found himself walking to the same spot where he had first seen Dean. The range was nearly empty now, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. As Matthews approached the corner of the range, he saw Dean again, this time sitting on a bench, wiping down his old rifle. He didn't look up when Matthews approached, but there was no mistaking the calm aura around him. Matthews cleared his throat, unsure of how to start. "Dean, I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but full of curiosity. "Yesterday, what you did, I've never seen anything like it. I don't think anyone has." Dean didn't respond immediately. He just continued to wipe down the barrel of his rifle, the action slow and methodical. Matthews continued, unable to hold back his questions. "How did you know? How did you know it was going to be perfect? The shot, I mean." Dean looked up then, his pale blue eyes locking with Matthews. "It wasn't about knowing," Dean said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about feeling. It's about trusting yourself. When you've been at it long enough, the shot becomes less about the rifle, less about the scope, and more about the wind, the ground, the moment. You don't think about it, you just do it." Matthews took a step closer, his eyes wide with the kind of respect that only a true student of the craft could understand. "You make it sound so simple," Matthews said. Dean smiled, but it was a faint, almost sad smile. "It's not simple. It takes years of failure, of close calls, and of getting things wrong before you get it right. The shot yesterday, it wasn't perfect because I had the best rifle or the best scope. It was perfect because I've missed 1,000 times, and each miss taught me something I needed to know. And now, it's about instinct." Matthews felt a shiver run down his spine. He had always been told that shooting was about precision, about calculations, about mastering the tools. But Dean was telling him it was about something deeper. "I've spent my entire career with my head buried in my gear," Matthews admitted. "My scope, my ballistics, the computers. I've always thought that was enough. But now I'm starting to see it's more than that." Dean nodded, his eyes distant as. He looked out at the empty range. "It's always more than that. You can't just trust the gear, Matthews. You have to trust your gut, trust your training, and most of all, trust the years you've spent in the field. When you've done this long enough, it's no longer about what's in front of you. It's about what's inside of you." Matthews felt a weight settle in his chest. For the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of being a sniper. It wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about understanding the world around you, about mastering yourself before you could ever hope to master the environment. He had spent years chasing perfection, but now, he realized, the true skill lay in embracing imperfection. Dean stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He grabbed his rifle and began to load it, but this time, Matthews didn't interrupt. He stood back, watching the old man with newfound respect. There was something about Dean that commanded it. Dean Peters wasn't just a sniper. He was a living legend, a man who had seen the world through a scope in ways most could never imagine. And yet, here he was, not flaunting his achievements, not basking in the glory of his past. He was simply carrying on, doing what he had always done, because that was what a true master did. Matthews took a deep breath, a sense of resolve settling over him. He knew that from this moment on, he would never approach his training the same way again. The next shot he took would be different. It wouldn't be about the gear or the technology. It would be about him, about his understanding of the moment, and about trusting his instincts. Dean Peters had shown him the way, and Matthews would never forget it. As the day wore on, Matthews returned to his training, but this time, with a new mindset. The range felt different now, it felt more alive. Each shot was no longer just a test of skill. It was a test of understanding, of mastery, and of embracing the quiet wisdom that came from years of experience. Dean Peters had given him more than a lesson in sniping. He had given him a lesson in life. The next morning, the sound of rifles echoed across the range, but this time, there was a different atmosphere in the air. The Marines were training with a renewed sense of purpose. Matthews stood among them, his eyes scanning the targets downrange, but his mind was elsewhere. The words of Dean Peters still rang in his ears, and now, more than ever, he understood what it meant to be a true sniper. As the day went on, Matthews couldn't help but think back to the moment when Dean had taught him the real lesson, that it wasn't about the technology, the gear, or the calculations. It was about instinct, experience, and the quiet wisdom that came from years of dedication. Matthews had learned that the best shots came not from the latest equipment, but from a mind that knew how to read the world, to understand the wind, the terrain, and the moment. Matthews had always prided himself on his ability to calculate the perfect shot, but now, he realized that he had been missing something vital. That something was the experience, the understanding that only time in the field could provide. As the Marines took their turns on the firing line, Matthews watched them carefully. He saw the same mistakes he had made just a day ago. Too much focus on the gear, too little on the surroundings. He watched as one young Marine struggled to make the perfect shot, his hands shaking slightly as he aimed at the target. Matthews could see it immediately. The Marine wasn't trusting his instincts. He was overthinking the shot. Matthews walked over to him, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Take a breath," Matthews said, his voice calm. "You're trying too hard. Trust your gut. It's not about the perfect calculation. It's about feeling the shot before you make it." The Marine looked up at Matthews, unsure at first. "What do you mean, sir?" he asked. Matthews smiled faintly. "Just relax. Forget about the gear, forget about the numbers. Focus on the wind, the terrain, and the target. Let your body do the rest. The shot will come when you stop forcing it." Matthews stepped back, watching as the Marine adjusted his stance, took a deep breath, and aimed once more. This time, the shot rang out, and Matthews watched as the target was hit dead center. The Marine looked up in disbelief, his eyes wide with surprise. Matthews nodded slowly. "See? You just had to. Trust yourself." As the day wore on, Matthews found himself taking on a new role, not just as a student, but as a teacher. He began guiding the younger Marines, helping them see what he had learned the day before. They were skeptical at first, unsure how letting go of the technology and trusting their instincts would make a difference. But as they practiced, Matthews could see the change in their eyes. They started to understand that sniping wasn't just about precision. It was about understanding the world around them and knowing how to adapt. Matthews was still learning, still growing, but he knew that this was the path to becoming a true sniper. The next time he fired his rifle, it wouldn't just be about hitting the target. It would be about reading the wind, feeling the moment, and trusting himself. As the sun began to set and the Marines packed up for the day, Matthews stood at the edge of the range, looking out at the empty targets in the distance. The lessons Dean Peters had given him had changed everything. He would never see sniping the same way again. It was no longer just about the equipment or the calculations. It was about the experience, the wisdom, and the quiet confidence that came with knowing how to read the field. Matthews turned to leave, his mind buzzing with the lessons of the day. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but think about the future. He had much to learn, and the road ahead would be long. But now, he was ready to walk that road with a new perspective, and that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Matthews found himself reflecting more and more on the lessons Dean Peters had taught him. The daily training on the range had become more than just a routine. It had transformed into an opportunity to truly understand the deeper aspects of sniping. Matthews had been shooting for years, but now, he was beginning to feel the pulse of the world around him. He could sense the wind before it picked up, feel the shift in the air, and, most importantly, trust his instincts when it came time to take the shot. Dean's words echoed in his mind. "It's not about the weapon, it's about the shooter." Matthews had started to notice the same shift, happening with the younger Marines too. At first, they had been skeptical, but as Matthews showed them how to trust their surroundings and not just the technology, their confidence grew. It wasn't easy for some of them. Many had been raised with the belief that sniping was all about the latest gear, the best scope, and the most precise calculations. But little by little, they began to understand. Matthews knew he wasn't the only one learning. Dean had given him more than just technical knowledge. He had given him a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a sniper, to be patient, and to remain focused on the present moment. It wasn't about speed or perfection. It was about knowing when to act and when to wait. One afternoon, as Matthews and his team wrapped up a training session, he decided to visit Dean again. The old man was sitting by himself, cleaning his rifle, the familiar calm demeanor he always had. Matthews walked up slowly, the sun low on the horizon casting long shadows across the range. "Dean," Matthews called out, his voice filled with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you again. For everything." Dean looked up, his eyes as steady as ever, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to thank me," Dean said, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know. You just needed to listen to what the world was telling you." Matthews sat down beside him, feeling the weight of Dean's words. "You make it sound easy," Matthews said. "But I know it's not. What you did, what you've seen, it's not something you can just teach. You had to live it." Dean nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "You're right. It's not something you can just teach. It takes years of living through it, of making mistakes and learning from them. The hardest part isn't pulling the trigger. The hardest part is knowing when not to." Matthews fell silent for a moment, taking in the old man's wisdom. "I still don't get it," he admitted. "How do you know? How do you trust yourself so completely?" Dean glanced over at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's not about trusting yourself completely," he said. "It's about knowing that you're never really in control. The wind, the terrain, the target, they're all unpredictable. What you can control is how you react to them. That's the key." Matthews processed the words, understanding them more deeply than he ever had before. It wasn't about mastery, it was about adaptation. The world would always change, and the true test was how you responded to those changes. Dean stood up, his rifle now fully cleaned and ready. He looked at Matthews, his expression softening. "You've got it, Matthews," he said quietly. "You're learning. Just don't get too caught up in thinking you know it all. That's when you start to miss the important things." Matthews stood as well, feeling the weight of the lessons settle in his chest. He wasn't sure if he would ever be able to fully grasp everything Dean had experienced, but he was learning, and that was enough. The next day, as Matthews stood on the range, preparing for another round of training, he felt more confident than ever. He had stopped overthinking every shot. He wasn't just trusting his gear, he was trusting his senses, his experience, and the world around him. The wind howled across the range, but this time, Matthews didn't fight it. He embraced it, letting it guide him. The first shot he took that day hit the target dead center. It wasn't perfect, but it was exactly where it needed to be. Matthews exhaled slowly, a smile crossing his face. He wasn't the perfect sniper, but for the first time, he was starting to feel like one. The day ended, and the Marines began to pack up their gear, but Matthews lingered for a moment longer. He looked out across the range, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. Dean's lessons had changed him, had made him a better sniper, a better Marine, and a better man. As he walked back toward the rest of the team, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that he was ready for whatever came next. Weeks had passed since Matthews began to embrace the lessons Dean Peters had imparted. The training had grown more intense, but Matthews found himself approaching it with a calmness he hadn't known before. The young snipers around him, once eager to show off their skills, now watched in silence as Matthews shot with precision that came from a new place. It was no longer about forcing the perfect shot. It was about being present in the moment and letting the shot come to him. The change didn't go unnoticed. Sergeant First Class Davis, one of the senior instructors, had observed Matthews' transformation from a cocky, equipment-focused sniper to a more intuitive, grounded Marine. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Davis approached Matthews after a particularly successful round of shots. Matthews was packing up his gear, his body tired but his mind sharp. "Matthews," Davis called out, his voice gruff but with a note of approval. Matthews turned, his hand resting on his rifle. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I've been watching you," Davis said, eyeing him closely. "Your shooting, it's changed. You're not just hitting targets anymore. You're in tune with the environment. I've seen the way you've been guiding the others." "What happened?" Matthews hesitated for a moment, thinking about how to respond. He had been learning so much lately, but it was hard to put it all into words. "I've started trusting the process, sir," Matthews said slowly. "Trusting the world around me, not just the equipment. It's about being connected to everything. The wind, the terrain, the target, and most of all, yourself." Davis nodded, clearly impressed. "Good answer," he said with a grunt. "But there's something else I want to see." Matthews raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Davis meant. "You've got the basics down now," Davis continued. But it's time to test your instincts, Matthews. There's a new course set up over on the other side of the range. I want to see how well you can adapt when things aren't as easy as they've been. Matthews felt a sudden rush of excitement and nerves. He had been challenged many times before, but this felt different. Davis wasn't just testing his shooting skills. He was testing his ability to stay calm under pressure, to react when the unexpected happened. "I'm ready, sir," Matthews said with confidence. "Good," Davis said with a nod. "Then let's see what you've really got." The course was set up in a dense area of the range, with targets hidden behind trees, rocks, and hills. The terrain was rough, the wind unpredictable, and the distance varied from close quarters to well over 1,000 yards. Matthews surveyed the area as he prepared to move out. He had to rely on everything he had learned. From Dean, to feel the wind, to watch the small shifts in the landscape, and to trust the knowledge he had gained over the past few weeks. As Matthews made his way through the course, his rifle felt like an extension of his body. The first target was close, about 200 yards away. Matthews knelt and took the shot, the bullet hitting the target perfectly. The next target was farther away, hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Matthews adjusted his scope, checking the wind and the terrain. He took a deep breath, then squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the target fell. Matthews didn't waste time celebrating. He quickly moved to the next position, the wind picking up again, swirling in unpredictable gusts. He knew it wasn't about speed. It was about precision, patience, and adapting to the environment. By the time Matthews reached the final stage of the course, he had hit every target with near-perfect accuracy. The last target was hidden behind a small rise in the ground, over 600 yards away. Matthews crouched down, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind had picked up again, and the landscape seemed to shift in front of his eyes. He adjusted his scope, calculating the wind's speed and direction, then adjusted his position, moving slightly to the left to compensate for the breeze. He took a deep breath, feeling the moment. With a steady hand, Matthews squeezed the trigger. The bullet flew true, hitting the target with a perfect shot. As Matthews stood up, a sense of calm washed over him. He had done it. He had trusted himself, his instincts, and everything Dean had taught him. He knew now that he had truly become a sniper. As he made his way back to Davis, the senior instructor was waiting for him at the edge of the course. There was a rare smile on Davis's face, a sign of approval Matthews had not seen before. "Well done, Matthews," Davis said. "You've proven that you're not just a good shooter. You're becoming a great one." Matthews nodded, his chest swelling with pride. But as he looked out across the range, he knew this was only the beginning. He had learned so much, but there was still more to come. Dean had shown him the way, but now it was up to him to continue the journey, to keep growing, and to embrace every challenge that lay ahead. As Matthews continued to train, the weight of his new understanding settled deeper within him. He had mastered the fundamentals of sniping, but now, a new challenge loomed ahead, the test of his adaptability in the field. The weeks of relentless training had sharpened his skills, but the true test of a sniper was not in controlled environments or predictable ranges. The real challenge was the battlefield, where every shot could mean the difference between life and death. Matthews had always known this, but now he truly understood it. It wasn't just about hitting targets at set distances. It was about being able to adjust in the heat of battle, to make split-second decisions based on the changing dynamics of the environment. One morning, the squad received a new assignment. They were to embark on a field exercise, a simulation of a real combat situation. The mission was simple in theory. They had to infiltrate a mock enemy camp, take out a series of targets, and exfiltrate without being detected. But as Matthews packed his gear, he felt a familiar knot in his stomach. This wasn't going to be like anything they had practiced before. This time, the stakes were real. The Marines were briefed early the next morning. The mission would take them through rugged terrain, dense forests, and hills that stretched for miles. It was a perfect test of their endurance, tactical knowledge, and, most importantly, their ability to adapt. The team was broken into smaller groups, with Matthews leading one of the squads. They moved swiftly and silently through the woods, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Matthews felt the same calm he had felt during his training, but this time it was accompanied by an edge of anticipation. Every step was measured, every sound scrutinized. The forest was alive with noise, birds calling, the wind rustling the leaves, distant footsteps from other groups in the exercise. As they approached the enemy's mock encampment, Matthews signaled for his squad to stop. He motioned for them to drop to the ground, their movements synchronized in complete silence. He studied the camp in the distance, watching the guards and the positioning of the targets. There was a high-value target, a simulated general, who had to be eliminated. Matthews could see that. Getting close to him without being spotted would require careful planning. The wind was in their favor today, light and consistent. Matthews made quick calculations, evaluating the range and the obstacles. His hand instinctively went to his rifle, and his eyes scanned the terrain. He had done this 1,000 times before, but now it felt different. The old man's lessons were at the forefront of his mind. It wasn't just about precision. It was about seeing the entire picture, reading the movement of the environment, and making sure every step counted. Matthews turned to his squad, quietly outlining the plan. "We're moving in from the west, using the trees as cover. We'll take out the sentries first, then move on to the target," he said in a low voice. "Stay sharp, keep it tight, and don't fire until I say so." The squad nodded, and Matthews felt the familiar tension settle into his muscles. This was what he had trained for, the moment when every skill, every lesson learned, had to come together in a single, decisive action. They moved forward, staying low, keeping their movements slow and deliberate. The first sentry was within range, standing near a stack of crates. Matthews knew he couldn't miss this shot. He dropped to one knee, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his scope. The wind was light, but it was still enough to affect the trajectory of the bullet. Matthews took a deep breath, his finger on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. He focused entirely on the target, letting everything else fade into the background. And then, with a squeeze of the trigger, the sentry collapsed, the shot echoing in the stillness of the forest. The squad moved quickly, methodically eliminating the remaining guards one by one. Matthews was in his element now, moving like a shadow, his rifle never missing a beat. As they neared the high-value target, the tension ratcheted up. Matthews signaled for them to hold. He had positioned himself at the perfect spot, hidden behind a thick tree, his rifle aimed at the general's position. The final shot would be a challenge. The wind was picking up, and the target was constantly moving, making it difficult to lock in a clean shot. Matthews could feel his pulse quicken, but he fought to keep his focus. He remembered Dean's words. "Trust your instincts, Matthews. The shot will come when you stop forcing it." Matthews took a breath and let it out slowly. He didn't rush this shot. He waited, patiently, until the target stopped moving just long enough to make the shot. With steady hands, Matthews squeezed the trigger. The bullet flew true, hitting the target dead center. The general dropped, the simulation coming to an abrupt end. Matthews allowed himself a small exhale of relief. The squad moved quickly to exfiltrate, their mission a success. As they returned to base, Matthews couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than just a successful mission. It was a testament to everything he had learned, to the hours of training, the lessons from Dean, and his own growth as a sniper. As the team debriefed, Matthews was approached by Sergeant First Class Davis, who had been observing from a distance. "You did good out there, Matthews," Davis said, his voice gruff but approving. "You've got a lot of potential, but don't get comfortable. There's always more to learn." Matthews nodded, feeling the weight of Davis's words. The mission was over, but his journey was just beginning. He had proved to himself that he could adapt under pressure, that he could trust his instincts and make the right decision in the moment. But he knew this was just the first of many tests. And as he walked away from the debriefing, Matthews felt a quiet confidence growing inside him. He was ready for whatever came next. After the mission, Matthews felt a shift within himself, something deeper than the usual satisfaction of completing a task. The field exercise had been a turning point. He had trusted his instincts, stayed calm under pressure, and executed each move with the precision he had been taught. But the true test was in the way he had adapted to the changing conditions around him. He had let go of his reliance on calculations and technology, embracing the chaos of the field. The sense of accomplishment, however, didn't last long. The next day, Matthews found himself standing before Sergeant First Class Davis once again. This time, the look on Davis's face was different. It was serious, almost unreadable. "Matthews," Davis began, his voice low but steady. "We've got a new mission. And it's going to test everything you've learned so far. We're going into the field. No simulations. No. Practice runs. Real-world conditions. Matthew straightened, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. He had felt the weight of each mission so far, but this felt different. It was as though Davis could see past his skills, past his instincts, to the real challenge ahead. "What's the mission, sir?" Matthews asked, his voice steady. "We're going to the border," Davis replied. "We've been tracking some movement, a potential threat. It's going to be a stealth mission. No noise, no trace. And we don't know exactly what we're up against. It could be enemy forces. It could be something else." Matthews felt his heart rate spike. This wasn't just a drill anymore. This was the kind of operation he had trained for, but never fully understood until now. "How long do we have?" Matthews asked, already thinking through his gear and preparation. "You leave in 20 minutes, Davis said. "I suggest you make sure your gear is in order." Matthews nodded, not wasting another moment. The next 20 minutes were a blur. He checked his rifle, made sure his scope was calibrated, and prepared his pack. The team was briefed and ready to go, their movements swift and efficient. No one spoke much as they moved out. The night air was thick with tension, and Matthews could feel his senses sharpen as they left the base. The terrain was rugged, the kind of uneven landscape where every step could reveal something hidden. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely offering any light as they trudged through the dense forest. The silence was deafening. The team stayed low, moving in perfect formation. Matthews's heart raced with anticipation, but his mind was calm. He had done this before, in training, but now it felt real. The further they went, the more the world seemed to narrow. They had passed the edge of the base and were now deep in enemy territory, or at least a place that felt like it. Matthews's thoughts kept drifting back to Dean Peters. What would Dean do in this situation? Dean would have been calm. He would have relied on his instincts and felt the flow of the environment, not the pressure of the mission. Matthews shook the thought from his head. He was here now, and he needed to rely on himself. As they continued, Matthews noticed the signs of disturbance in the terrain, a broken branch here, a displaced rock there. They weren't alone. There were others moving through these woods. The question was, who were they? Matthews's mind clicked into high gear, reading the landscape, understanding the subtle signs that told him something was off. He signaled to his squad to stop. They crouched low, blending into the shadows. Matthews pointed to the ground where the earth was disturbed. The tracks were fresh. Too fresh. This wasn't an ordinary patrol. Whoever it was had been here within the last few hours. "Stay sharp," Matthews whispered, his voice barely audible. The squad nodded, their eyes scanning the area. Matthews led them forward, moving slowly, the tension thick in the air. Every sound felt amplified in the silence of the forest. They moved like shadows, each step deliberate. As they neared the ridge, Matthews could see the faint glow of light in the distance. There was a camp down below. The team stopped just short of the ridge, taking cover behind large boulders. Matthews motioned for them to spread out, each man in position to observe. "We've got a visual," Matthews whispered. "Looks like a small encampment. Could be hostile. Keep your distance." The team set up their positions, scanning the camp through their scopes. Matthews's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. There were men moving around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were armed, but Matthews couldn't tell whether they were enemies or just local militia. "What's the plan, sir?" one of the Marines asked, his voice low. Matthews took a moment to consider their options. They could wait and gather more intel, or they could move in. But with the unknown threat so close, every second counted. "We move in," Matthews said firmly, but quietly. "We take out the guards, then gather intel. We're here to observe, but if we have to engage, we will." The team prepared to move. Matthews's heart was steady now, the fear and uncertainty replaced by the calm resolve that had come with his training. They would carry out the mission as they had been taught, methodically, efficiently, and with complete focus. As Matthews led them forward, he felt a sense of clarity. This was no longer just about sniping or shooting. It was about making the right decisions, about leading his men through the unknown with the knowledge he had gained, and about trusting in everything that had brought him here. Dean's lessons had been about more than just perfect shots. They had been about understanding the moment, trusting the environment, and knowing when to act. And now, Matthews was ready to face whatever lay ahead. As Matthews and his team moved forward, they were hyper-aware of their surroundings. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and the tension in the air thickened with every step. Matthews could feel his heartbeat in his ears as they neared the camp. His instincts were on high alert. Dean's lessons echoed in his mind. Trust the environment, feel the moment, don't rush. The team crouched low behind the trees and rocks, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Matthews could see the camp more clearly now, the flickering light of the campfire casting shadows on the ground. A few guards were positioned at the perimeter, their attention mostly focused on the campfire, unaware of the approaching threat. Matthews signaled to his squad, motioning for them to take their positions. They would move in silently, eliminating the guards one by one, before getting closer to gather intel on the camp. The first guard was standing near a small hut, his back to them. Matthews could see the faint silhouette of his rifle slung over his shoulder. Matthews raised his hand, signaling to one of the Marines, Corporal Smith, to move in. Smith nodded, slipping silently into the shadows, his movements fluid and controlled. Matthews watched as Smith approached the guard, his steps barely making a sound on the forest floor. With a swift and efficient motion, Smith neutralized the guard, dragging him out of sight. Matthews exhaled quietly, feeling the weight of the moment. There was no room for error. The squad moved forward, picking off the remaining guards with precision, their movements synchronized and practiced. The forest had become their ally, hiding their presence as they closed in on their target. As they neared the heart of the camp, Matthews slowed his pace, signaling for the team to stop. The camp was more active now, with several figures gathered around the campfire, their faces shadowed by the firelight. Matthews could hear snippets of conversation, but it was difficult to make out what they were saying from this distance. He motioned for the team to stay low as they approached, using the trees and bushes as cover. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, but Matthews knew that wouldn't cover their presence for long. They needed to act quickly. He scanned the camp for the high-value target, the person they were really after. He spotted him, a figure sitting alone by the fire, surrounded by a few others who seemed to be listening intently. Matthews's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. The target was within reach. But Matthews hesitated for only a second. Something was off. He could feel it in the air. The atmosphere had shifted. The camp wasn't just a simple enemy position. It was more organized, more prepared than Matthews had anticipated. He scanned the area again, his mind racing. Then he saw it, the faintest glint of metal reflecting in the firelight. A second set of guards, hidden in the shadows, had positioned themselves in a way that Matthews hadn't noticed before. They were watching, waiting. Matthews signaled to his team to hold, his finger pressed to his lips. The squad froze, silent as ghosts. They were caught in a delicate moment of decision. Matthews knew that if they acted too soon, they would be exposed. If they waited too long, they would lose the element of surprise. Time felt like it had slowed down as Matthews analyzed every detail in front of him. He had learned to trust his gut, and now his instincts were telling him that they needed to shift their plan. He turned to Corporal Hayes, one of his most reliable men, and spoke in a low voice. Get eyes on the second set of guards. We can't move forward without taking them out first. Hayes nodded, his face a mask of focus. Matthews turned his attention back to the target. He needed to act fast. The team had already made it this far, but the real danger was still ahead. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. As Hayes crept into position, Matthews kept his eyes trained on the high-value target, his finger hovering near the trigger. The wind shifted, just slightly, and Matthews felt a surge of calm. He was ready. He trusted his instincts, just as Dean had taught him. Hayes's voice broke the silence. They're clear. We can move. Matthews didn't hesitate. He signaled for the team to move in. The operation was back on track. They advanced quickly, silently, closing in on the target. The camp was in chaos now, but the team remained composed, their training taking over. Matthews's eyes never left the target, his heart steady as he prepared for the final shot. As they got closer, Matthews's mind raced through every possible scenario. But there was only one thing left to do. He would take the shot when the time was right. And when the moment arrived, he would be ready. Matthews's finger tightened on the trigger, and the sound of the shot rang out, cutting through the night. The target dropped, and the team quickly moved to secure the area. The mission was complete. But Matthews knew this wasn't the end. There would always be more challenges, more decisions to make. And with each one, he would trust the lessons he had learned, from his training, from Dean, and from the environment itself. The mission was a success. The target had been eliminated, and the camp had been cleared. Matthews and his team moved quickly through the woods, making their way to the extraction point. The adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins since the operation began was now fading, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. They had executed the plan flawlessly, but Matthews knew that this success was not just about hitting the target. It was about something deeper, something he had learned over the past few weeks, the importance of adaptability, of trusting his instincts, and of making decisions in the moment. As they reached the extraction point, Matthews took a moment to look around. The forest was eerily quiet now, the sounds of their movements the only noise in the stillness. He felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, the familiar presence of the weapon that had become an extension of himself. But this time, the rifle was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol of everything he had learned, the lessons from his training, the lessons from Dean Peters, and the lessons from the field. The helicopter arrived moments later, its blades slicing through the air as it landed in a clearing nearby. The team climbed aboard, their faces tired but satisfied. Matthews sat back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The hum of the helicopter, the whirring of the blades, was a constant presence, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the challenges he had faced, and the growth he had experienced. He thought about Dean Peters, the old man who had taught him more than anyone else ever had. Matthews had always been good with a rifle, but now, he understood the true meaning of being a sniper. It wasn't about the gear, the equipment, or the perfect shot. It was about understanding the world around you, about reading the environment, and about trusting yourself when everything else seemed uncertain. As the helicopter flew back toward base, Matthews's thoughts drifted to the future. He knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, and that each mission would require more from him than the last. But he was ready. He had the skills, the experience, and the wisdom to succeed. And with each challenge, he would continue to grow. The mission had been a success, but Matthews knew that success was never guaranteed. The real test was in the next mission, the next challenge, and the next decision. As the helicopter descended toward the base, Matthews felt a sense of peace. The lessons he had learned, the growth he had experienced, had prepared him for whatever lay ahead. He had found his place, his purpose, and now, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. The doors of the helicopter opened, and Matthews stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a quiet thud. The team followed behind him, and Matthews felt a quiet confidence in the way they moved. They were ready for anything. As he walked toward the briefing room, Matthews took a deep breath. The mission was over, but his journey was just beginning. Back at the base, Matthews felt the weight of the mission slowly lifting from his shoulders. The helicopter had touched down without a hitch, and the team had disembarked, their movements synchronized from months of training. They were all tired, but they shared a quiet satisfaction. The mission had been clean, efficient, and most importantly, successful. Matthews could feel the eyes of the other Marines on him as they made their way back to the briefing room. They knew, just as he did, that this mission had been a test, not just of their skills, but of their growth. Matthews had been leading from the front, guiding them through difficult terrain, making decisions that had kept them safe. But it wasn't just about the mission. It was about the change he had felt within himself, the transformation that had happened since he first started. He had started as a young, cocky Marine, over-relying on his gear and his calculations. But now he understood. It wasn't about the newest technology or the highest-tech rifle. It was about the ability to read the environment, to stay calm when things got tense, and to trust your instincts. As the team entered the briefing room, Matthews felt a new sense of purpose. The senior officers were already there, waiting for them. Sergeant First Class Davis stood at the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He scanned the room as the team filed in, then nodded toward Matthews. "Well done, Matthews," he said. "You led the team through that operation with precision and control. But this is just the beginning. You've got the skills now, but what separates the good from the great is how you handle the next challenge. Always be prepared to adapt." Matthews nodded, his heart beating a little faster. The words weren't just praise, they were a challenge. The next mission, the next test, was already in his mind. As the briefing continued, Matthews couldn't help but think back to the moment on the field when he had made the decision to change the plan. He had trusted his gut, and it had worked. He thought of Dean Peters again, the old man who had taught him the most valuable lesson of all: trust yourself and the environment around you. It wasn't always about being right. It was about being adaptable and learning from every situation. After the debriefing, Matthews walked back to his quarters, his mind buzzing with everything that had just happened. The next mission was still a mystery, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready. He had taken everything he had learned and applied it. It wasn't just about sniping. It was about leadership, decision-making, and understanding the bigger picture. Matthews sat down on the edge of his bed, reflecting on how far he had come. He thought of the young Marine he had been, the one so focused on gear and perfection, and compared it to the man he was now, someone who knew the value of experience, of trust, and of making decisions in the heat of the moment. He had learned how to shoot, yes, but more importantly, he had learned how to lead, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to adapt to whatever situation came his way. Matthews knew that this was just the beginning. Every mission would be a new challenge, a new opportunity to prove himself, not just as a sniper, but as a Marine. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base below. The night was quiet, but Matthews knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. There was always more work to be done, more training to be had, and more lessons to learn. But now he felt ready for it all. He had come a long way, and no matter what came next, he knew he would face it with the same calm confidence that had carried him through his training. He was no longer just a sniper. He was a Marine, ready to take on whatever came his way. The days following the mission passed quickly. Matthews found himself in a quiet rhythm, the constant hum of daily life at the base blending with the ever-present anticipation of the next challenge. But even in the calm, there was something different now. He had changed. He had proven to himself that he could trust his instincts, lead his team, and face whatever came his way with confidence. Yet, with each passing day, Matthews realized that true leadership, true mastery, didn't come from moments of success alone. It came from the humility to learn, the strength to adapt, and the ability to stay grounded when everything around you shifted. One evening, Matthews was called into a meeting with Sergeant First Class Davis. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Matthews sat across from Davis, his mind sharp, knowing that this meeting was different from the usual debriefs. Davis studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Matthews, you've come a long way," Davis began. "Your performance in the field, the way you handled the team, the decisions you made, it was impressive. But that doesn't mean the work is over. There's always more to learn. And you need to keep pushing yourself, because in this line of work, complacency is the enemy." Matthews nodded, understanding the gravity of Davis's words. "I'm ready, sir," he said quietly, but with resolve. "I know there's still more for me to learn." "Good," Davis said with a slight nod. "We've been watching your progress, and there's an opportunity coming up for you to take the next step. It's a real operation, a mission that requires the skills you've demonstrated, but it'll push you even further. This time, you won't be working with a team of Marines. It'll be you, alone in the field, with a very specific target. This is your chance to prove that you can operate at the highest level, without anyone watching your back." Matthews felt his pulse quicken. The idea of working alone was both exhilarating and intimidating. He had been trained to rely on his team, to lead them when needed, but now he would have to rely on himself completely. No backup, no support, just him and his rifle, the environment, and the mission. "What's the target, sir?" Matthews asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline building in his chest. "It's a high-profile individual, someone who poses a significant threat. Your objective will be simple. Take him out without being detected. You'll be dropped in a remote location, and you'll have to make your way in undetected. The timing is crucial. The target's location will change throughout the mission, so adaptability will be key. You'll need to be at your best, Matthews. This is your chance to show us that you've become the sniper we know you can be." Matthews took a deep breath, his mind racing as he thought through the details. A solo mission. He had always been part of a team, but now he would need to lead himself. He had no doubt in his abilities, but there was a heavy weight that came with knowing how much was at stake. "Understood, sir," Matthews replied, his voice calm, and unwavering. "I won't let you down." The days leading up to the operation felt like they were dragging on. Matthews spent every waking moment preparing, studying maps, reviewing intel, and fine-tuning his gear. He felt the pressure mounting, but it was a pressure he welcomed. He knew that this was the next step in his journey, the one that would push him beyond what he had learned so far. He was no longer just following orders. He was leading himself, relying on everything he had learned to face the unknown. The day of the mission arrived, and Matthews found himself at the airstrip, waiting for the helicopter that would take him to his drop point. His heart was steady, his mind focused. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now, he was ready. The helicopter lifted off, the base growing smaller beneath him as he ascended into the sky. The wind whipped around him as the chopper banked, heading toward the drop zone. Matthews's thoughts were clear. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't complacent either. He knew what he had to do, and he trusted in his ability to adapt, to make the right decisions when the time came. As the helicopter approached the drop zone, Matthews stood up, securing his gear. The door opened, and the cold air rushed in, a reminder of the isolation that lay ahead. He jumped, the earth rushing up to meet him. When his feet hit the ground, he immediately took cover behind a nearby ridge, scanning his surroundings. The area was quiet, too quiet. Matthews's instincts kicked in, and he began moving through the terrain with purpose. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened as he worked his way through the dense forest, always staying low, always aware. The target was out there, but Matthews knew the key wasn't just finding him. It was remaining undetected and executing the mission with the precision he had honed over the years. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. He had done this countless times in training, but this time was different. There was no backup, no support. There was only him and the mission. And as Matthews moved deeper into the wilderness, he felt a calmness settle over him. He wasn't just ready for this mission. He was ready for whatever came next. The lessons from Dean Peters, the experiences from his past, and his own growth as a sniper had led him here. He had become someone who could handle the unknown, someone who could trust his instincts and adapt in the face of uncertainty. As the target came into view, Matthews knew that this was just another step on his journey, but it was one he was fully prepared for.